You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for? Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em!
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Sega Genesis review here on Player One Start. The purpose of the Sega CD was to expand the capabilities of the Sega Genesis. Not only would it provide up to 320 times the capacity of a normal game cartridge, but it would also upgrade the graphics and sound. But the upgraded graphics and sound is almost like an unexpected bonus. The CD was the main selling point of this add-on. And that's because in the early 1990s, CDs were seen as kind of the future of where technology was going. Anything that still used those old bulky cartridges were going to be seen as something that was obsolete, or a kid's toy, or, someone that a Nintendo gamer would play. That's just something that was going to be obsolete. And Sega was a company that did not want to be seen as being obsolete. Their marketing relied hugely on the Sega Genesis being touted as the cutting-edge console. For example, blast processing was touted in their advertising as an advanced feature that the Super Nintendo couldn't even do. So when CD-based add-ons started coming out for other consoles, for example, NEC had one released for their PC Engine, and eventually here in the United States they released the TurboGrafx CD, that would mean that the Sega Genesis would start to look very dated very quickly, and Sega just really couldn't have that. So when Nintendo also announced that they were going to partner up with another third party to develop a CD-based add-on for their system, Sega thought it was a no-brainer. They had to put out something. But maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and take a look at the history and the development behind this hardware add-on. In mid-1990, Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama hired Tom Kalinske as CEO of Sega of America. Kalinske had developed and implemented his 4-point plan for sales of the Genesis. With initial reluctance from the Japanese board of directors, all 4 points were approved by Nakayama, which eventually led to skyrocketing sales of the Sega Genesis, as those that were waiting for the yet unreleased Super Nintendo in North America decided to buy a Sega Genesis instead. By the early 1990s, compact discs were making significant headway as a storage medium for music and video games. NEC had been the first to use CD technology, at least in terms of putting it inside of a video game console, when they released their PC Engine CD-ROM 2 system add-on in October of 1988 in Japan. Launched in North America as the TurboGrafx CD the following year, which sold 80,000 units in 6 months. That year, Nintendo announced a partnership with Sony to develop its own CD-ROM peripheral for the Super Nintendo. Commodore International released their CD-based CD-TV multimedia system in early 1991, while the CDI from Philips arrived towards the end of that year. Shortly after the release of the Genesis, Sega's Consumer Products Research and Development Labs were tasked with creating a CD-ROM add-on, which became the Sega CD. The Sega CD was originally intended to equal the capabilities of the TurboGrafx 16, but with twice as much random access memory, and sell for around $150. In addition to relatively short loading times, the team planned the device to feature hardware scaling and rotation similar to that of Sega's arcade games, which required a dedicated digital signal processor, or DSP. However, 2 changes made later in development contributed to the final unit's higher than expected price. Because of the Genesis's Motorola 68000 CPU being too slow to handle the Sega CD's new graphics capabilities, an additional 68000 CPU was incorporated in the add-on itself. In addition to hearing rumors that NEC planned a memory upgrade to the TurboGrafx CD, which would bring its available RAM from 0.5 megabits to between 2 and 4 megabits, Sega decided to increase the Sega CD's available RAM from 1 megabit to 6 megabits. This proved to be one of the greatest technological challenges since the CD's access speed was initially too slow to run programs effectively. The cost of the device was now estimated to be at $370, but market research convinced Sega executives that consumers would be willing to pay more for a state-of-the-art machine. Sega partnered with JVC, which had been working with Warner New Media to develop a CD player under the CD plus G standard. Until mid-1991, Sega of America had been largely kept uninformed of the details of this project. They didn't even have a functioning unit to test, although Sega of America was provided with the preliminary technical documents earlier in the year. A former executive of Sega of America noted that there was distrust between Sega of Japan and Sega of America, stating that they only wanted to provide dummy units because they were afraid of what would happen if they leaked out the technical specifications. However, they were finally able to get a working machine by acquiring the system ROM chip and putting it into a dummy unit. Sega of America was also frustrated by the Sega CD's construction, with some being especially critical of the consumer-grade audio CD drive that was used instead of a CD-ROM drive, which were better suited to reading data disks. Also, right before the launch, the quality assurance teams started running into severe problems with many of the units literally bursting into flames. Teams worked around the clock trying to catch the failure in progress, and after about a week they finally realized what was happening, citing the need for games to use more time seeking data than the CD drive was designed to provide. The Sega Mega CD launched in late 1991 in Japan, and though the unit sold quickly, the small install base of Mega Drives in Japan meant that sales sharply declined. Third-party development of games for the new system also suffered because Sega took a long amount of time to release software development kits. Other factors affecting sales at the beginning included the high launch price and only 2 games available at launch. On October of 1992, the Sega CD was released in North America with the retail price of $299. Advertising slogans included, "Welcome to the next level." Though only 50,000 units were available at the launch due to production problems, the Sega CD sold well over 200,000 units by the end of 1992. As part of Sega's sales, Blockbuster Video purchased several Sega CD units for rental in their stores. One feature emphasized by Sega of America was the benefit that the Sega CD's additional storage allowed for a large amount of full-motion video games, with digital pictures becoming an important partner for Sega. Sega released a second model of the Sega CD in April of 1993. It was released in North America several months later at a reduced price of $229, bundled with one of the system's best-selling games, Sewer Shark. The Sega CD2 was designed to bring down the manufacturing costs of the Sega CD. The newer model is smaller and does not use a motorized disc tray. A limited number of games were also developed that used the Sega CD and the later 32X add-on that was released in November of 1994. However, it was in late 1993 when the Sega CD would gain the most notoriety, at least here in the United States. On December 9, 1993, the United States Congress began to hold hearings on video game violence and the marketing of violent video games towards children. One game at the center of this controversy was Sega CD's Night Trap, a full-motion video adventure game designed by Digital Pictures. Night Trap had been brought to the attention of U.S. Senator Joe Lieberman, who said, "It ends with this attack scene on this woman in lingerie in her bathroom. I know the creator of the game said it was meant to be a satire of Dracula, but nonetheless, I think it set out the wrong message." Lieberman's research concluded that the average video game player was between 7 and 12 years old, and that video game publishers were marketing violence towards children. In the United Kingdom, questions were also raised about its suitability. This came at a time when Sega was capitalizing on its image as an edgy company with attitude, and this only served to reinforce that image. And even though there were increased sales as a result of the hearings, Sega recalled Night Trap and released it with revisions in 1994. Following these hearings, video game manufacturers also came together in 1994 to establish a unified rating system. The Entertainment Software Rating Board was born. However, this did not hurt sales of the Sega CD or the game Night Trap. In fact, all the publicity surrounding the Sega CD and Night Trap actually spurred sales of the game and the console. So with that said, why didn't very many people seem to remember owning a Sega CD? Well, in terms of CD-based add-ons from this time period, the Sega CD actually sold the most out of its competitors, with around 2.25 million units sold before being discontinued. So what caused a decline in the Sega CD? Well, mostly it was newer CD-based consoles such as the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer. These consoles would render the Sega CD technically obsolete very quickly, and that reduced the public interest. After all, most people who adopted this console wanted to show off that they had the latest and greatest technology. Unfortunately, technology in the 1990s was always ever-changing, with home computers not only doubling and sometimes tripling their processing power within a period of about 6 months. In late 1993, less than a year after the Sega CD launched in North America and Europe, the media reported that Sega was no longer accepting in-house development proposals for the Mega CD in Japan. In early 1995, Sega shifted its focus almost exclusively to the Sega Saturn, having discontinued advertising for Genesis hardware, including the Sega CD. Sega officially discontinued the Sega CD in the first quarter of 1996, saying that it needed to concentrate on fewer platforms and felt the Sega CD could not compete at its high price and outdated single-speed drive. So that history is kind of intriguing because you almost wonder why the Sega CD wasn't its own console. Think about console upgrades today. The closest equivalent I could find would be something like the PS4 Pro over the PlayStation 4, providing better graphics and, I don't know, maybe better sound than its predecessor, the PS4, without actually being the next console. The Xbox One X is the same exact deal, providing 4K graphics over the original Xbox One's graphics. Graphics and sound is what this add-on is all about. It was meant to increase the capabilities of the Sega Genesis, as well as accommodate the massive storage medium of CDs, providing up to about 320 times the capacity for games. But to fully understand the advantages of the Sega CD, we have to take a look at the hardware. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The Sega CD received several variations during its lifetime, of which Sega constructed 3 different models. The original model, also known as the Model 1, utilized a front-loading motorized disc tray that sat underneath the original Sega Genesis. These units are becoming much more rare and harder to find for game collectors, and as such, I do not own one in my collection. However, you can see that the front of the Sega CD has no buttons or ports to use. All of the controls handled through the Sega Genesis and its controllers. The CD tray itself slides out for you to place a disc on. To open the disc tray, you actually have to press the reset button on the Sega Genesis. You can press the button again to close it, or just give the tray a little push and it'll automatically close. To the right of the tray are 2 lights, Ready and Access. The Ready light will turn green when the system is turned on and everything is functioning properly, and the Access light will blink red whenever the system is reading a disc. On the back, it has 3 ports. There's the Sega CD RCA Stereo Out, which runs stereo sound over RCA Composite out of the back of the Sega CD, and next to that is the Sega CD Audio Line In. This port is used with the audio mixing cable that is plugged into the original Sega Genesis Model 1 at the headphone jack. And lastly, there's the power port. That's right, the Sega CD and the Sega Genesis require 2 separate power supplies. Taking a look inside the Model 1, you can see some of the hardware which makes this console tick. First item of note is the main CPU, which is a 12.5 MHz 16-bit Motorola 68000 processor. It runs about 5 MHz faster than the Sega Genesis processor. It contains 1 megabit of boot ROM allocated for the CD game BIOS, CD player software, and compatibility with CD plus G discs. 6 megabits of RAM are allocated to data for programs, pictures, and sounds. 512 kilobits of PCM waveform memory, 128 kilobits for CD-ROM data cache memory. On the other side of the processor, you'll notice the GPU, which is clocked at about 6.25 MHz. And an additional 64 kilobits are allocated as the backup memory. However, this can be upgraded to up to 1 megabit by using a backup RAM cartridge. However, even that wasn't released until towards the end of the console's life cycle, and hence is also rare today. Taking a look at the Sega CD Model 2, you can see that there are some minor changes made. Most notably, they got rid of the motorized tray and replaced it with a lid mechanism. When plugged into the Sega Genesis Model 2, it is no longer required to have the Sega Genesis headphone jack plug into the Sega CD's audio in port to mix the audio from both the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD. Taking a look inside, you can see how they were able to reduce cost by reducing the size of the motherboard and combining some of the chips. One thing to note on this console that since game saves are saved in battery-backed RAM, it will be necessary to replace this battery, or else you'll lose all your game saves in the future. So the biggest and perhaps most obvious upgrade that the Sega CD provides to the Genesis is the fact that it can include full motion video. Now I've heard a lot of people make fun of that term, full motion video, as opposed to video that isn't in full motion. Well, believe it or not, it's called full motion video for a reason. Here's an example of a video that is not in full motion. So I guess this would be considered not full motion video because the frame rate's kind of bad, but according to Wikipedia, full motion video is a video game narration technique that relies upon pre-recorded video files rather than sprites, vectors, or 3D models to display action within a game. So I guess based on that definition, this too would be full motion video. So yes, that is a video file, but as you can tell, you take steps through different stilled images. So not all video was full motion, and the fact that you said that video was in full motion meant that you had a frame rate that would provide you with video that looked like it was in motion. You know, that may seem kind of crazy today to specify it as full motion video, but back in the mid to early 1990s, there were a lot of videos that were like that still image one that I showed you. In fact, that particular video was from 1996 on a PC game. So full motion video was something you could tout in your advertising as something being superior to your competition. However, full motion video wasn't the only upgrade that the Sega CD provided the Sega Genesis. In fact, it also provided it with scaling and rotation effects as well as an expanded color palette. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. Looking at the graphical capabilities of the Sega CD, it is interesting to note that this is also combining the capabilities of the Sega Genesis with all of the new hardware in the Sega CD. So in many games, different objects on the screen are rendered by one console or the other. For example, in a lot of full-motion video games, the video is being generated specifically from the Sega CD alone, and any of the HUD elements or on-screen menus and icons will be generated from the Sega Genesis. This made programming for the console a bit more difficult as they had to sync everything up so that it would match what both the Sega CD and the Genesis were drawing at the same time. However, the biggest upgrade that the Sega CD offered in terms of just regular graphics was the scaling and rotation effects. Let's take a look at a few examples from games that use these effects. So the scaling effects are actually very nice. In fact, I think they're done better on the Sega CD than they are on the Super Nintendo, which can only scale and rotate backgrounds. The problem with the scaling and rotation effects is that I couldn't find as many examples of them than I could for full motion video. I mean, full motion video really does steal the show. And maybe that's because it was a lot easier for programmers to just make a full motion video clip and dump that onto the CD than it would be to program a scaling and rotation effect on backgrounds, sprites, and other things. So when I talk about full motion video on a Sega CD, let's take a look at what that looks like. Full motion video was almost its own genre that started on the Sega CD. For a lot of people, this would be the first time that anyone would see computer-generated video on a television screen, and Sega marketed this very heavily in their advertising and their marketing campaigns. And that led to a lot of shock and awe that you can tell has been severely dated. Looking at this footage now versus being in the early 90s are two widely differing perspectives. Mainly the problem is that even though this was the best at the time, they did not age well as it has gotten a lot better. And once you've seen what future generations can do, you really don't want to go back to this unless you're really nostalgic for what the content was. Even still, when I personally go back to look at some of these games that I thought looked really cool and impressive back in the day, I actually wish that the video resolution was a bit better, or I would be wishing for a faster frame rate, or a sharper image, or more colors. It's just something that doesn't really hold up well today, and you don't want to go back to. On the other side, I can see why some people find this very nostalgic, especially when they grew up with it. And I think the only way I can relate to that is the fact that some people like to go back and watch movies that are in black and white, or even silent movies. Sure, the technology has improved, but sometimes the content will make it worth it to go back and just relive through some of these memories. However, in the Sega CD's case, unfortunately, there are a lot of things that were put out that were just a gimmick at the time to get people to buy the game. And the games themselves ended up not being very good. And I think that's why the Sega CD has somewhat gotten a reputation for having a poor game library. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. As mentioned before, the GPU has a clock rate of about 6.25 MHz. The Sega CD is capable of producing 64 on-screen colors at once, however using programming tricks, this limit can be increased to about 128 to 256 colors via raster effects, which basically means swapping out color palettes when drawing pixels on the screen line by line. Building off how the Sega Genesis builds its graphics, the Sega CD uses 5 layered planes. One of them is the Sega CD full motion video layer. On top of that layer, programmers can overlay 3 other layers, using the Sega Genesis hardware being enhanced by the Sega CD, giving them 2 tile layers or background layers and 1 sprite layer. These layers are explained in the graphics section of the Ultimate Sega Genesis review. The Sega CD is capable of producing full motion video from about a quarter of the screen to full screen, using advanced compression schemes and software-based upgrades. With just the Sega CD and the Sega Genesis, the number of on-screen colors can vary between 128 to 256 colors, which may seem like a lot at first, but when you consider that the modern digital cameras in your cell phones make images out of millions of colors, you can tell why the detail on these videos do not look as good. Again, one of the biggest feature enhancements over the Sega Genesis is that the Sega CD can scale and rotate not only background layers, but also sprites. This is based off of Sega's Superscaler technology that they used in the arcades back in the late 80s, early 90s. And although it was seldom used, the Sega CD is also capable of generating 3D polygon graphics, producing 16,000 vertices a second, 5,000 triangles a second, or 4,000 quads a second. This is when running at a screen resolution of 256 by 160 pixels, at around 15 to 30 frames per second. The number of polygons is reduced when using flat shaded polygons, and even more when using texture mapping, dipping to around 2,000 polygons a second, which isn't really that much, but considering what the Sega Genesis could do, this was leaps and bounds above that hardware. So again, most likely due to the fact that full motion video really kind of steals the show, and you can kind of pre-render any background you want and just show it in a video. So you can have graphics that wouldn't really be capable on this system, but you can just render it on another system and then dump the video onto the Sega CD, and suddenly the Sega CD can show it. Since that is a reality on this system, I wasn't able to find any tech demos that really max out the graphical capabilities of this system. If any of you out there are aware of a tech demo that has been created for the Sega CD hardware, please let me know in the comments below. I'd really like to take a look and see what programmers have done to kind of max out what the system is able to do. So since full motion video is a capability of this system, it kind of takes the fun out of the tech demos. However, the Sega CD also has a lot of ports of Sega Genesis titles on it, and a lot of you may ask why. Well, the biggest reason was the upgraded soundtrack. So Sega actually did do a major upgrade to the sound capabilities of the Sega Genesis in terms of music synthesis. So the stock sound chip on the Sega Genesis is not really well suited for sound samples. However, as many game programmers found out, it was probably just easier to record a CD soundtrack of your synthesized music using another platform that you're probably already using. I mean, you could even use professional sound synthesis equipment and just record one big sample and make it a CD audio file. And that would be cheaper and more time effective when programming games.
We're sorry. This disc is not intended for audio playback. It has been manufactured for use on the Sega CD system only. If you have played this recording in error, then please choose CD-ROM now.
Of course, if we were to look at sound, there is a huge advantage that the Sega CD brings to the Sega Genesis, and that is the ability to play full-quality CD audio. And especially for those that don't care for the synth music that the Sega Genesis produces, I think this is a most welcome addition. However, in terms of going over the technology behind it all, it can be a bit boring as there's no really music synthesis going on other than playing some sort of PCM sample. Some games took advantage of this by actually recording either orchestral or live musical renditions of the video game's soundtrack. However, some games just recorded a higher quality version of the synthesized music tracks, sometimes using professional synthesis equipment. When the Sega CD is playing just CD digital audio, it is playing it with 2-channel stereo at a sampling rate of about 44.1 kHz, with 16-bit PCM audio depth. This is the same exact specification as any normal audio CD. However, on top of these 2 sound channels, the Sega CD also has a Rico PCM sampling chip that provides 8 additional sound channels to the Sega Genesis's 10 audio channels. The sounds played are 8-bit mono PCM samples. However, you are allowed to get some stereo support by allowing each channel to have different volumes on both the right and the left channels. The maximum sample rate for synthesized music is 32 kHz, again with the same 16-bit PCM audio depth as normal CD audio. One feature of the hardware of the Sega CD that is actually really nice is the line-level stereo audio they have out through RCA connectors in the back of the console. This is great for not only hooking up to a TV, but also for hooking into a more professional sound system, as it will provide crisper and cleaner audio than having it go through something like a headphone jack. So that said, I'm not going to be comparing the difference between CD sampled audio on here and sampled soundtracks that are synthesized using the Sega CD. I'm just going to show you some examples that are highly regarded of music on the Sega CD. here are some examples from games that were on the Sega Genesis that got an upgraded soundtrack. Let's compare their soundtracks from the stock Sega Genesis chip to how they sound on the Sega CD. So do I think just an upgraded soundtrack would be worth the extra $200 I would have to spend on the Sega CD to get it, plus buying the game again? No. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of the Sega Genesis sound chip to begin with, and I think there are some beautiful music tracks that were made on that chip, but I don't think it would have been worth it to me to upgrade just for the upgraded sound. So overall, I think the sound upgrade is a good thing on the Sega CD, but I don't really know if it'd be worth it for you to upgrade just for that. For the Sega CD's launch in the US, Sega was bound and determined not to repeat the mistakes it made with the launch of the Mega CD in Japan. Sega held a press conference in New York on October 15th to launch the console, giving the press a preview of the system. There were 20 games planned for the launch window, with a further 24 leading up to spring of 1993. For the first 6 months of the Sega CD's launch, it was packed in with a 2-disc compilation set containing Sega Classics Arcade Collection, which just combined 4 different cartridge games, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Columns, and The Revenge of Shinobi, as well as a second disc containing Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, Volume 1, as well as a separate box for Soul Feast, making a grand total of 5 different games technically, which Sega of America touted was an over $300 value in itself, which, considering what you would have to do to buy those games separately at the time, was probably about right. To further improve over Sega of Japan's launch, Sega of America devoted roughly 1/3 of its research and development workforce to Sega CD products. As a result of this decision, Sega's American arm became the largest developer of Sega CD software across the globe, overtaking Sega of Japan, which were struggling to keep the add-on afloat in their native territory. Sega of America President Tom Kalinske outlined 5 different types of Sega CD games, the first being the Value Disc, which would be a compilation of 4 to 6 Sega Genesis titles previously released on cartridge. Another type which he called Enhanced Cartridges, which would act as enhanced versions of a cartridge game, usually with better sound effects and/or more levels. He also described interactive cinema games, which became known as full-motion video games. He also talked about unique animation games, which didn't have an example, but most likely he was referring to polygon-based games, as he said that this will be the first time players will be able to interact with true computer graphics rather than bitmapped images. The last type of game he described was a type of entertainment that he said defied definition, with the prime examples being cited were the make-your-own-music videos. So based on these genres, defined by the president of Sega himself, I decided to go ahead and structure my review in this fashion, rather than trying to go through the typical video game genres. And also another note about how I do the ultimate reviews. First off, while I do a lot of research to kind of showcase some of the best games and some of the most recognizable games, as well as a few hidden gems, I am often limited to how many games I can collect for a system before I put out the ultimate review. And in the case of the Sega CD, the average price per game, even for loose titles, is a bit on the high side, somewhere ranging between $30 to $50 for loose titles, and $50 to hundreds of dollars for complete in-box titles. And this is a system I actually like to collect complete in-box, and that is also another hindrance because a lot of these cases are very fragile and hence have not survived well. Another thing to keep in mind is that you are not likely to run across a wide variety of Sega CD titles, as a lot of these games can be very rare. Luckily, I do live near a couple of retro game stores that specialize in locating these exceptionally rare items. However, they also have the price to match. So yeah, Sega kind of had to do everything their own way in the 90s. I mean, yeah, they copied a lot of what other people did and tried to make it their own, but in this case, they kind of redefined what genres the Sega CD would be built for. And to tell you the truth, it's strangely accurate for the type of games that came out. So rather than go through like action and then adventure and then puzzles and all that stuff, I'm actually just going to use their genres to kind of show you what the Sega CD was built to do and what it ended up putting out there. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive into some of the games. There were about 10 games available at launch. Let's go ahead and do a quick overview before we dive into each one.
Looks like you're not up to this mission. Breaking contact.
I'm going to start out by showing you the boot process in real time. So as you can see, it takes about 25 seconds for the console to actually boot into the opening logos. And depending on the game developer, you could either skip the videos or you had to watch them each time you booted the game. Thankfully in this case, Sega had a very short intro and we topped out at about 34 seconds. Well, to start out with, the Sega Classics Arcade Collection would have been a great game for those that were brand new to the Sega Genesis. However, if you played these games before in the Sega Genesis, you may be sorely disappointed because these are the same exact games, except for some minor differences. Some differences noted by other gamers was that the version of Revenge of Shinobi in this collection only included the Spider-Man boss fight, with Godzilla and Batman being replaced with substitute enemies. Golden Axe is the only game in this collection that has external CD audio, and I feel compelled to say how much I prefer this to the actual Sega Genesis soundtrack. Let's listen to a couple of comparisons. But other than the sound differences, this gameplay is exactly the same. The same goes for Streets of Rage, which I have also already covered in the Ultimate Sega Genesis review, so I'm just going to show a couple of samples of here. The only difference I could tell was that the digitized voices benefit from the extra capacity of CD audio. Moving on to Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, this is the first game where you really feel the loading times as the single-speed drive struggles to keep up. But anyway, in this game, a full-motion video starts out each case that you pick.
What rubbish! What balderdash!
You must have read something terribly disturbing, Watson, for you to be so overwrought this early in the morning.
Indeed, Holmes. It's irresponsible of the Times to play upon people's superstitions.
And it depicts Holmes and Watson meeting a client and learning a few background clues about the case. The player must then visit a particular location or person, read the newspaper, or ask one of the young Baker Street irregulars to investigate. The object of each case is to gather enough clues in the shortest time possible, then go before a judge who will ask the player to answer important questions about the case. If the player is successful, a full-motion video clip will take the player back to Holmes and Watson's study, where they will review the events that transpired, and Dr. Watson will inform the player of his or her score based on the length of the time it took to solve the case. Overall, this game is okay if you like point-and-click puzzle adventure games, but this is not really my cup of tea. The video quality is poor by today's standards, and the production quality was poor by standards back then, with some reviewers noting that the video production quality seemed to be that of low-end television. As a launch title, it definitely does show the possibility of making full-motion video games on the platform. However, I feel that the subject matter may not appeal to all types of gamers. If I would have got this included with my Sega CD along with the other games at launch, I wouldn't have been too disappointed. However, if I bought this separately, I would have been massively disappointed.
Accuracy. We find this publication to be of invaluable assistance in our investigations, and I'm sure you will as well.
Game Creative Staff, Wolf Team.
Wow, what an intro. So Sol Feast is a horizontally scrolling shooter. Controlling the starship, the player is tasked with preventing a malfunctioning supercomputer before it enslaves all of mankind. The objective in each stage is to destroy the incoming enemies and avoid their projectiles. The Sol Feast starship has a pair of dual cannons that can be modified to point either forward, backwards, or diagonally, and can be arranged in parallel to each other. To power up your ship's weapons, you can shoot small capsules that float around the screen, and they will leave behind power-up items. These can include homing missiles, piercing lasers, and a wide shot. The game is composed of 6 stages. Each of these end with a boss fight that must be defeated in order to progress. The boss fights require you to figure out where a weak point is that can be shot at to inflict damage. In between each stage are animated cutscenes that help explain the game's plot, complete with full voice acting. At the time of its release, Sol Feast was met with mixed reviews from critics. Some praised the game's visuals, fast-paced gameplay and soundtrack, but others criticized its lack of originality and for being subpar when compared to other shoot-'em-up titles available at the time. However, I personally think this is one of the better of the launch titles that I have played for this system. This game fully utilizes the extra sprite count and scaling and rotation. Granted, I don't think it's the best shooter that you can get on this platform, but it's pretty far up there, and I'd rank this at around a B+, A- kind of a title.
The year 2160 AD. It is a time when Earth's technology enables mankind to send spaceships on missions to other planets. The Earth's population and its accompanying urbanization created a need for raw materials in the building of skyscrapers and underground cities. Eventually, the planet's natural resources were unable to meet the demand of its growing population. And in order to solve mankind's need for natural resources, a number of exploratory missions have been sent to other planets in search of valuable raw materials.
So I'm not quite sure how, but that opening story description somehow leads to one of the worst fighting games I've ever played. So basically, the objective in the single-player mode of this game is that you fight 8 different enemies in the form of giant robots. Each battle between the player and the enemy takes place over 1 round, and you only have 5 continues if you lose. There is a timer on each match, and if that runs out, your player's machine blows up. So if you think this game looks fun, what went wrong? I found the game boring and uninteresting. The gameplay didn't really keep me engaged, the graphics are okay for a Sega CD title, the soundtrack leaves something to be desired, at least from my point of view, and one of the reviews when this game was released called the game pure, unadulterated tedium. And to tell you the truth, there's no way I can top that. That basically sums up this game for me. Cobra Command, also known as Thunderstorm in Japan, is an interactive movie game originally released by Data East in 1984 as a Laserdisc-based coin-operated arcade game. This port was developed by Wolf Team and was released in 1992, again as a launch title in North America. So basically this game is an interactive movie where the player watches scenes as a helicopter flies by the zone of conflict. The game screen is represented by the helicopter's cockpit, and the player controls crosshairs that can be moved to aim at the enemy forces. The player can either fire a machine gun or missiles. In certain points of the game, you must move the D-pad into a certain direction so that your helicopter will not crash and explode into the surrounding scenery. If at any point in the gameplay you make a mistake, there's an animated sequence that shows the Cobra helicopter blown up and the player loses a life. If all lives are lost, the game over screen appears, and the Cobra is in smoldering ruins. And from my experience, you will see this screen a lot unless you have all of the obstacles memorized. And that's pretty much what this game really comes down to. How fast can you memorize all of the game's obstacles? Because it plays the same every single time you play the game. While the game is a bit visually impressive for basically looking like you're playing through a cartoon, I have to say the gameplay mechanics got really tiring really quickly and just became very tedious. I think this game would have been great to rent over a weekend back in the day, and then you could challenge your friends to see how far you could each make it into the game or try to beat each other's high score, and then return it to the video game store so you can pick up another title that may keep your interest a bit longer. Overall, I'd rate this title at about a solid C. It's not terrible, but it's not the best game I've played by any means. And it does kind of recreate that era of video games where laserdiscs were used in arcades, so if you're a fan of that type of playing style, this game might not be too big of a disappointment for you. It is unfortunate that I can't play any of the audio from these Make My Video games because it'll get flagged for copyright, but the only thing I'm going to say here is that this is not really a video game at all. This is purely a gimmicky type of game for people who are fans of this music back in the day, and I'm not even sure if you were a fan of this music today that you would want to go back and play these games, because the audio quality is a bit poor, the video quality is very poor, so I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to collect these unless you're going for the full set.
Birds were singing, weather was fine. Chuck Rock settled down, waiting for the rock game to start. Things had never been better for Chuck.
Chuck Rock was originally released in 1991, developed by Core Design for the Atari ST and Amiga computers. The game takes place in a fantasy prehistorical Stone Age era that is shared by Neanderthals, woolly mammoth, saber-toothed tigers, dinosaurs, and various assorted wild primeval monsters. Chuck himself is an overweight, square-jawed caveman character who is defined by loutish and lewd behavior, perhaps influenced by the lad culture in the UK in the 1990s. Chuck wanders around each stage and only has a basic set of moves, which basically boil down to lift, jump, and belly bump / attack. Chuck can pick up various types of food to increase his score, or collect hearts which increase his health. But basically, aside from that, your main goal is just to make it to the end of each stage. There are also some puzzle elements to the game where certain rocks are used to reach higher areas, and some prehistoric creatures must help Chuck get to certain other parts of the level. Overall, it's a solid platformer, but I would also rank this around the C title, basically being another standard platformer, only this time on the Sega CD. This game was also available on the Sega Genesis, but again, its soundtrack is much improved on the Sega CD, in my opinion. Sewer Shark, which was eventually packed into the Model 2 Sega CD, is basically an on-rail shooter. It's on-rail because, well, all of the game's graphics are full-motion video. And again, this is almost exactly like Cobra Command, where all you have to do is just memorize where the targets are at, because it shouldn't change with each playthrough.
Hey, relax. Pretend it's a game.
A couple of interesting notes is that the video footage in this game were directed by visual effects artist John Dykstra, who had previously worked on films like Star Wars. This game was also originally developed for a cancelled VHS-based ControlVision video game console, but eventually found a home on the Sega CD. And possibly due to it being a pack-in title for the Model 2 Sega CD, this game is one of the best-selling Sega CD games that were ever released for the console. And although it was well received at the time, again, I am not a fan of this type of action. It did initially provide me with some entertainment, but that quickly faded away once I found out that the gameplay is more or less just memorizing where obstacles are and trying to get to the end of each level. I would rate this title today at a solid D. It has a high production value, but leaves me with very little entertainment to show for it. And the last launch title that it leaves me with is Night Trap. No one can argue that this is probably one of the most influential games in video game history, as it was cited as one of the examples for the formation of the ESRB. However, prior to its exposure in the media, the game wasn't really selling well, and actually got a huge boost in sales specifically because it was touted as one of the most graphic and horrifying games of all time. And to tell you the truth, although there are some strange events in this game, I'm not sure if I agree with that opinion. I mean, true, it could be that I'm playing the edited down version, but I would consider the stuff that happens in this game pretty mild by today's standards. And also, if you've never played this game, I would say consider yourself lucky. Basically, this is a game of just searching around different camera feeds that you can see and just guessing what you're supposed to do. There are no hints, tips, or tricks. You just have to try to figure it out for yourself and see what works. Now, I've heard the Switch version is a lot easier because they've built in some things that make it a little more obvious what you're supposed to do. But as for the original on Sega CD, all I can say is I am not a fan of the gameplay. There's really no appeal to me, other than this game's status in video game history. So do I think it's worth the price being charged for it on the collector's market? I don't think so. You can definitely pass on this one, unless you're just going for the game collection, or if you want a historic piece in your collection. So how does the launch lineup of the Sega CD here in the United States stack up? Well, first I'm going to say I think that this is a good amount of titles for a system launch. I'm not quite sure if the variety of titles would appeal to all gamers, but I think what came with the system would at least be enough to get people started. I think the sad thing, though, is that I think the best games that would have been packed into the original Model 1 would have been the Genesis titles. That and Soul Feast, which Soul Feast was kind of an unexpected treat for me. To tell you the truth, this is one of those games that I hadn't really heard of until I started doing research for this video series. And that was just something I wasn't really expecting. I didn't consider myself a fan of all the scrolling shooter games until I started playing the Sega Genesis, because there are a lot of good shooters on there. And Soul Feast, while not the best, is a good example on the Sega CD, and probably would have been one of my favorite titles had I got this console at launch. The Make My Video games would not appeal to me back then. I actually found them a bit humorous today, but unfortunately I can't play any of the audio from those games, so I had to skip over those. I think some of the titles that would have drove home one of the big selling points of this console back when it launched would have been those FMV titles that showcased the games that were previously on Laserdisc in the arcades. Because that was a genre that had yet to make it into the home, and this is the first time, at least that I can recall, that these titles would have been in the home. Now, in my personal opinion, these game titles lack a bit in gameplay and are only meant for short bursts, not for playing through an entire home game experience. But this is another example of how Sega tried to bring the arcade experience home, so that is something I think was actually a good thing for Sega to include at launch. Overall, though, I think the only thing that is missing from the launch lineup is that killer app, the one that would have just made people flock to the Sega CD. It is very strange that Sega of America and Sega of Japan didn't really cooperate well with one another. They were almost at odds with each other. And I think that if Sega of America had really had full control over the launch of the Sega CD in North America, they probably would have launched it with a Sonic game. And I think that is what this console needed to spur strong sales off quickly. But that said, let's go ahead and start taking a look at some other games. The launch lineup really left a lot to be desired, at least for me, especially because they didn't include a Sonic game. And yes, the games we're going to cover in this video does include Sonic CD. But there is something I've always heard from people who may or may not have played the Sega CD. Whenever they criticize it, they always say, oh, it's lacking in its game library, and the only game worth playing is Sonic CD. Now keep in mind, that's not my personal opinion, you'll see that here in a little bit, but that has been the opinion I have seen reiterated several times when people talk about the Sega CD at all. So is Sonic CD really the only game worth playing? Well, let's go ahead and take a look. And just as a reminder, we're going to be looking at these games using Sega's self-defined game genres that they came out with in the 1990s. We already covered the only value disc compilations out there, so I'm going to move on to the enhanced cartridge games. These were games that were meant to be designed like a typical cartridge game, however, they would use the expanded capabilities of the Sega CD, such as using FMV or scaling and rotation effects, as well as adding a full CD quality audio soundtrack. Some of these games would be enhanced remakes of previous titles released on cartridge, and some would be unique or exclusive to the add-on itself. Let's go ahead and boot up the Sega CD and try a few of these out. So that was a lot of games, and to tell you the truth, we're not going to be able to cover all of them in this video. But to help speed things along, I'm actually not going to recover any games that I reviewed in the Ultimate Sega Genesis review. The one thing I can say that kind of sums up most of these ports to the Sega CD is that they are roughly the same game, but with minor differences, maybe some extra levels, and of course, an enhanced soundtrack. The biggest exception to this review I found was The Adventures of Batman and Robin, where the game was really completely redesigned to just be a driving game, at least in my experience. I didn't play all the way through the game, but I got about a half hour to an hour into it and didn't hit any levels that was not based on driving the Batmobile. That said, the games we are going to cover are going to be the games that are specific to the Sega CD, if not exclusive to it. Again, I've already covered Sonic CD in its own review video, so I'm not going to recover it again here. Let's go ahead and get started with a few games that are really some hidden gems of the system. The Adventures of Batman and Robin is a series of video game adaptations released between 1994 and 1995, featuring the DC comic characters of Batman and Robin, based on Batman the Animated Series, which was retitled The Adventures of Batman and Robin for its second season. These games were released for numerous platforms, with the Genesis, Game Gear, and Sega CD versions published by Sega, while the Super NES version was published by Konami, who had also published an earlier Game Boy video game based on the show. And unlike other game ports from the Sega Genesis, the Sega CD version of this game is actually entirely different from the Genesis version. The main element of gameplay in this title is a series of chase scenes involving the Batmobile and the Batplane. Between levels, the story advances through animated cutscenes that were created specifically for the game. The animated cutscenes were produced by Warner Bros. Animation. Most, if not all, of the cast from the show reprised their roles for this game, which, yes, included Mark Hamill himself as the Joker. In total, these animated segments make up about 17 minutes of the game, leading to some fans of the show to call this the lost episode of the series. In terms of graphics and sound, this game actually delivers on the promise of the Sega CD, using the scaling and rotation effects to provide almost arcade-quality pseudo-3D racing effects for the time. In terms of gameplay, for the first couple of levels, this actually isn't too bad. However, the gameplay does get very stale and repetitive very quickly. I think this game would have been better served by actually porting over the Genesis title, which is very fun, and mixing in the new driving sequences throughout that game. However, back when this game was first released, I think what would have kept motivating me to play through this game would be so I can watch those animated cutscenes of the show, only this time through my Sega CD. Overall, while I don't feel this title is an essential part of your game collection, it would definitely not be a disappointment to those who are a fan of Batman the Animated Series around this time. Android Assault: The Revenge of Barry Arm is a shoot-'em-up game developed and published by Human Entertainment. In this game, players control the Barry Arm through 7 shooting stages. The Barry Arm has 4 ship speed levels and is equipped with a fully automatic shot and charge weapon. In typical shoot-'em-up style, the player can also upgrade their speed and weapons by picking up power-ups after destroying certain enemies or on-screen objects. When this game was released, it was given a negative review by GamePro, commenting that it was a decent but outdated game, especially when compared to other CD-based shooters. Electronic Gaming Monthly praised the soundtrack but criticized the graphics as being mediocre for a CD-based game. Overall, my experience was mostly similar to those reviews. It's not a terrible game and is definitely playable, but especially due to the high price to collect this game, I don't really feel it's worth it when there are better shooters to collect on this platform.
These are the golden lands of Cheshire. Lands which were secure and prosperous via the equal radiance of both the brilliant warmth of lightness and the elusive mystical darkness. But suddenly, from out of nowhere, the nightmare of those turbulent years is once again about to return, to unfold unto an entirely new, unsuspecting generation.
Dark Wizard is a role-playing video game developed and published by Sega for the Sega CD. The game takes place on a hex-style map and features turn-based tactical battle scenes. The player controls one of 4 playable characters, each with their own attributes, abilities, and available units. Upon its release, this game received mixed to positive reviews, with Electronic Gaming Monthly giving it a 7 out of 10, commenting that excellent videos and battle sequences will please Sega CD fans wanting more of this type of game for the system. And I have to tell you, this game is actually pretty good, especially if you like the real-time strategy, tactical role-playing game. This one was hard to put down for me, and I would definitely recommend it if you're a fan of this genre. Dune was actually an unexpected delight for me to find on this console. This is a 1992 action strategy video game based upon the science fiction novel of the same name. Developed by Cryo and published by Version Games, Dune blends adventure with economic and military strategy. Loosely following the story of the novel, the player takes the role of Paul Atreides, with the ultimate goal of driving the Harkonnen from the planet Dune, while managing spice extraction, military, and later ecology through the native Fremen tribes. As the game progresses, the troops are equipped with better weapons, the player taps into the character's latent psychic powers, and gets better acquainted with the other characters. This game was originally released on the Amiga and IBM PC compatibles. It was one of the first floppy disk games to be converted to CD format. Taking advantage of the new storage space, they actually included footage from the film, as well as voice acting for all speaking roles, and highly improved 3D rendering travel sequences and location screens. This game is actually a blend of the Amiga's graphics and the extras of the PC CD versions. I have to say, I was strangely drawn into this game and actually ended up playing most of the way through it, if not completing it. This game reminds me a lot of those early point-and-click adventure games that came out on PCs in the early to mid-90s, but I think the biggest draw is the strong story. And out of the other point-and-click adventure games I played for the Sega CD, I think this one is probably my favorite.
I'm Gurney Halleck. I've served the Atreides for a long time. I've just come into contact with the Fremen. The Fremen have always lived in the sands of Dune. They live in sieges so well hidden that no one knows exactly how many there are.
The Misadventures of Flink is a 2D side-scrolling platform game. This game was originally published in the UK for the Mega Drive, but strangely it did not receive a Genesis port, it only showed up on the Sega CD. This game received mixed to positive reviews upon its release, with some calling it a standard typical side-scrolling platformer that adds nothing new to the genre, to some calling it near perfection, and simply put, the best Sega CD action game ever made. For me personally, I think the gameplay is pretty solid. It's definitely one of the better than average platformers that I've ever played, but the biggest hindrance to getting this for your collection is going to be the price, as it is a rare title. I think this game can be better appreciated today, as this game was not as cutting edge as many people thought the game should be for the Sega CD.
Start your engines. Go!
Jaguar XJ220 is a pseudo 3D racing game released by Core Design. The game takes place in a series of championship races across 12 different countries, each with 3 races. The player starts in England but must decide which country to go to next, which costs the team various amounts of money. The player must also choose to repair damage to their car. If it is in red, it has to be repaired before continuing. This game received very much favorable reviews upon its release, and from my experience, this actually reminds me a bit of the graphics of Outrun in the arcades, and this would have been a most welcome game back in the day. However, I'm not sure this game has aged as well as other racing games of the time. This was back during the time where 3D racing games really showed the limitations of the hardware. However, there aren't very many racing games for the Sega CD, so this one is definitely worth a pickup if you want a racing game.
In the 8th year of the KO era, Japan neared the end of its feudal period. The shogunate, facing an uprising by the anti-government movement, asked France for military help in order to suppress the rebellion.
Kaio Flying Squadron is a scrolling shooter video game for the Sega CD, developed by Victor Entertainment, and first published in Japan in 1993, later hitting North America and Europe in 1994. This game is characterized by its unique art style that combines Japanese culture of both ancient and modern simultaneously. The game consists of the player riding on top of Spot, who can shoot fireballs at enemies. When Spot is not firing, two smaller companion dragons appear one after the other to assist the main character. The smaller dragons shoot smaller fireballs, and can be sacrificed to do larger damage, only to reappear when the main character stops shooting. This game is yet another example of a game that is incredibly fun on the Sega CD, but will be unlikely that you can find it for your console because of how rare it is, and hence how high the price is. In fact, I believe this is the most expensive game you can get for the Sega CD, at least as of the recording of this video. Lords of Thunder is a shoot-'em-up game originally made by Hudson Soft for the Turbo CD. It eventually made its way to the Sega CD in 1995. What's unique about this game is its heavy metal soundtrack. In this game, the player takes control of the legendary knight Duran, who sets off to defeat Deroric's army in 7 different stages. The first 6 are selected in a manner similar to Thunder Force 3. Once the stage is selected, the player selects one of 4 armors based on the 4 classical elements. Choosing the correct armor for each stage will yield better and easier results. Reviews at the time were a bit mixed when this came out because it was mainly compared to the Turbo CD's edition, with many reviewers noting that this game is slightly inferior. While I can't attest to that, I can attest that the gameplay of this game is strongly addicting, and I really appreciate the aesthetic and the soundtrack. Unfortunately, again, this game is a bit on the rare side and expensive, but thankfully this game has been re-released several times, with the TurboGrafx CD edition being released on the Virtual Console for the Wii in 2008, as well as being released on the PlayStation Network. Overall, a game I would definitely recommend to those that like this kind of game.
Of all who fought, only 3 returned to tell the story. For the Black Seal holds fast, protecting mankind from certain destruction at the hand of the Overlord.
Popful Mail is a 2D platform game with several RPG elements. The plot of this game varies based on the port you are playing. However, in this game, it is set in an unnamed fantasy world. A prologue tells of a grand legend relating to 3 fallen gods of darkness known as the Masters of Evil that attempted to lay siege to the mortal plane. When the game sets off, the main character and local bounty hunter makes her rounds. Eventually, her day escalates to the point where she squares off with her bounty, and the plot takes off from there. The player can jump, attack, open doors, or treasure chests, as well as speak to another character. Eventually, the player can bring up a menu to change some of the game's attributes, including the current character's equipment, use or activate an item, read the game's status, save, load, and quit. The only RPG element that was lacking in this setup is the ability to level up your character. Upon release, the Sega CD version of this game got an average of about 7.75 out of 10. Critics especially praised the game's cinema scenes and extensive voice acting. I didn't really get too much into the story of this game, but I did enjoy the gameplay elements. It offers a playstyle that I really like out of action RPGs, while still retaining the simplicity of a 2D platformer. Again, rarity and large expense would be the only reasons why I wouldn't recommend collecting this title. Snatcher is a cyberpunk graphic adventure game that was developed and published by Konami. It was written and designed by the legendary Hideo Kojima, and was first released in 1988 for a different system. Kojima wanted Snatcher to have a cinematic feel, so the setting and story were heavily influenced by science fiction films, especially Blade Runner. This game has been discussed by critics and fans as setting the stage for Kojima's later works, and is often touted as a must-have for this system. However, due to its rarity and price, it will be a challenge getting this for your collection. I wasn't able to get too far into this game, but it was fun from what I played for, and yes, definitely did remind me of some of Kojima's later work, while still providing me that early 90s PC adventure game kind of feel.
My name is Mika Slayton. I'm the administrative assistant and operator here at Junker headquarters. Very pleased to meet you.
Soulstar is a third-person rail shooter video game. What this offers over the other shooting games on this platform so far is its unique third-person perspective, placing the player behind the ship. This game received mixed reviews upon its release, but it reminded me a lot of Galaxy Force on the Sega Genesis, and that game was actually not too bad. The gameplay here can get a little bit repetitive, but I think the real draw to this game is going to be the impressive graphics and sound that was accomplished on the Sega CD. The Sega CD version of the Terminator is actually an entirely revamped game than the cartridge version. This game is noteworthy for its extensive musical score that is actually pretty darn good. The gameplay here is actually very addicting as well, and I would definitely recommend this to those of you that like shooter games similar to Contra. My only criticism of the game is that it does seem a bit dark, and I think that was an intentional art decision because the Terminator itself is a pretty dark film, but it also could be due to limitations of the color palettes in both the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD. Overall, I would recommend this game as one of those that you should not miss on the Sega CD. So it appears that the Sega CD's library is a bit more expanded than just Sonic CD. There are a lot of great games on this system. It's just like every other console. There's going to be games that are good, there's going to be games that are bad too. The other point that I see people make when they talk about the game library on here are that most of the games released for the system were full-motion video games, and all of those are just bad, just because they're full-motion video games. We're going to take a look at the games that the Sega CD is probably the best known for better or for worse, and that is the FMV, or full-motion video games. These games are probably remembered best today as being the gimmick that sold the Sega CD. Full-motion video on a game console was not really widely accepted or even widely known about until this happened. Most people's experience with this would most likely have been on the Sega CD first, and possibly those that had the higher upgraded PCs that actually had a CD-ROM drive, number one, but also PCs that could display full-motion video back in 1992 were few and far between. So consumers seeing this on their television through a game console back at that time would have been the cutting edge of technology back then. And Sega's marketing team was not shy about touting this feature as the reason to get a Sega CD back in the day. However, a lot of people have found out that a lot of these games are not that good. However, my question is going to be, are they all bad, or were they just misused because of the gimmick to sell games? So as is tradition, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these games before taking a deep dive into a few of them. Microcosm is a 3D rail shooter video game developed and published by Sega Genesis in 1993. This game featured realistic FMV animation, with the graphics being rendered on Silicon Graphics workstations. The Sega CD port of this game features a third-person perspective. The game's plot is set in the future, where two evil conglomerate corporations battle for supremacy. The player in this game takes control of a microscopic submarine that is sent to destroy enemy microscopic droids in their corporation's president. To do this, you start out the game by being injected into the bloodstream of the president, and then you just go around shooting all the other enemies around you. Even by today's standards, I would say this is a strange concept for a game, but the game is actually not too bad. The graphics and sound alone should be enough to take you back to the early 90s, and although some would feel that the gameplay only offers just about the same as every other rail shooter out there, I feel that average does not make a bad game. So I would rate this at around the lower B, upper C range of a game, and for those of you looking to expand your Sega CD library, I don't think you'll be too disappointed in this one. Now here's a strange video game. This is a game based on the R-rated movie Bram Stoker's Dracula. And strangely, this isn't the only platform that this game came out on. However, the Sega CD version is a bit unique. This game makes use of fully digitized backgrounds that are pre-rendered and then shown on screen, making this about the only FMV platformer I can find on this system. By stepping forward, it moves the video forward. By stepping back, it does the reverse. The game consists of 7 stages based on the movie, complete with full motion video cutscenes of the movie in between. Based on the gameplay alone, this game is, it's not that great. The gameplay is stale and repetitive, and it really feels like that the game developers focused on dazzling the player with full motion video sequences and graphics, and even those don't look too impressive, so I wouldn't recommend this game for everyone, but if you are going for a complete collection, it's not going to break the bank to get it.
Emergency. Bogies approaching. All interceptors scramble now. Repeat. Bogies. All interceptors scramble immediately.
Alright, let's see if I can get this right this time. Sylphid is a video game developed by Game Arts, and it made its debut in the Japanese PC market in the mid-80s. Sylphid is the name of the spacecraft the player controls. This game itself is a vertical scrolling shooter. Like many shooter games, the story revolves around using the Sylphid as Earth's last defense to save itself from destruction by a powerful enemy invasion. This game is unique because it uses polygon-rendered ships over pre-rendered video backgrounds. Upon its release, this game received very positive reviews, stating that it is a simple shooter, but the gameplay is very solid. And critics especially noted that the video backgrounds were probably the most stunning visuals in a video game to date. Some criticisms were the unimpressive bosses, mediocre power-ups, and especially the lack of interaction with the backgrounds as some of the game's biggest problems. However, I say this game is pretty solid and holds up a bit well today. If you're looking for some of the early polygon shooters, this would be one that I would suggest getting.
It is a period of civil war. Rebel spaceships striking from a hidden base.
Star Wars Rebel Assault is a rail shooter video game developed and published by LucasArts for a variety of systems including the Sega CD. As stated in the title, it is set in the Star Wars universe and is the first CD-ROM only game to be published by LucasArts. The game's story focuses on a young pilot called Rookie One as they are trained by, and subsequently fights for, the Rebel Alliance in the Galactic Civil War. The game features digitized footage and music from the original movies, although most of the original footage is replaced by CGI rendered sequences and full speech. The game makes extensive use of pre-rendered 3D graphics that were far ahead of what contemporary PCs and game consoles could render in real time. Developers would pre-render various environments, and the player must battle their way through them. This game was a huge commercial success for LucasArts. Critics praised the graphics and the soundtrack, however, they were very critical of the lack of replay value and the fact that a lot of the game environments were randomly thrown in and required the player to have knowledge of the movies. It was the Sega CD version, though, that received the brunt of all the criticism, as the graphics were a lot less sharp on this system, and the controls were seen as an inhibitance to gameplay. I do find the controls to be very wonky, however, I am a fan of Star Wars, so I think that's what drew me to this game. It did provide me with a little bit of fun, however, after about 15 to 20 minutes, I got tired of it very quickly. So just be aware that I don't think this title is one of the better ones to collect, and may only be for those hardcore fans of the Star Wars movies.
It is 2500 AD. Humans, after a long period of peace and prosperity.
AX101 is a rail shooter FMV video game for the Sega CD released in 1994. And this game I'm going to mark just slightly below average. I didn't care for the sound effects in this game, so I ended up turning the sound down while playing it, and the visual presentation isn't really inspired. But what I think this game really suffers from is that it is incredibly short, with many reviews noting that it takes less than 30 minutes to beat the game on the normal mode. Others have also noted that the faceless characters and basically non-existent plot doesn't really leave a lot for the player to relate to in this game. So again, I think the people that will enjoy this are going to be the hardcore collector crowd and not the casual collectors.
We did it, Captain! Hey, that was a piece of cake!
Don't let it go to your head, Bob. Remember, one slip and we're done for.
15 years after it had sealed itself off, humankind returned to the daylight.
Cadillacs and Dinosaurs: The Second Cataclysm is a video game made by Rocket Science Games and based on the comic book Xenozoic Tales. The game was first released for the Sega CD before being ported to the PC. This game is nothing like the first version created by Capcom, which was a beat-em-up game in the arcades. This game is more of a rail shooter, featuring full-motion video especially created for the game. An interesting tidbit about this game is that Elon Musk supposedly worked as a programmer on this game. Critics of the time praised the graphics, but again stated that the gameplay and the theme of the game wasn't very thrilling, remarking that there wasn't much to do here but shoot and steer. And that was my experience as well. This game was kind of a neat concept, but didn't hold my interest very long once I started playing, so unless it's absolutely necessary for you to get all of them, I would give this game a pass. Novastorm is a rail shooter video game developed by Psygnosis in 1994. This game takes place sometime in the distant future, as seems to be the trend with a lot of these games. The player takes control over a spacecraft in 4 different environments. Each level ends with a boss fight which the player must complete to proceed. During the course of each level, the player gets attacked by groups of enemies. Taking out every enemy in a particular group produces a token of bronze, silver, and gold. These tokens are used like credits to obtain power-ups, and upon picking one, the power-up bar at the bottom of the screen moves along by differing amounts depending on the color of the token. At the time of this game's release, critics gave the game a mixed review, stating that even though the graphics were very impressive despite the low resolution and lack of full color, but the gameplay was overly easy, lacking in intensity, and the game could easily be finished in a standard 2-day rental, which is what I would recommend as well. It's not necessarily a waste of time, but it's not going to hold your attention for very long, and because the video doesn't change with each playthrough, there is no real replay value. Alright, one last rail shooter game that I'm going to point out here is Starblade. This game was developed and published by Namco, originally in arcades in 1991. Upon its release in arcades, it was praised for its 3D graphics and cinematic presentation. It is often cited as an important and influential game in 3D video games, serving as the inspiration for games such as Star Fox, Panzer Dragoon, and Rez. However, the home ports, including the Sega CD version, was criticized for not expanding much beyond the original arcade game and for their low replay value. However, in my personal opinion, I think this is one of the better rail shooters that were released for the Sega CD, especially since I can tell the influences it had on games like Star Fox. I would definitely say this one is worth a try. One last game we're going to take a deep dive into is Tomcat Alley. This is another interactive movie FMV video game developed by Codemonkeys for the Sega CD. It was the first Sega CD game to feature extensive full-screen, full-motion video. In this game, the player controls a United States Navy pilot who has to bring peace and stability to the world after the cash-poor former Soviet Union sold off some of its military equipment to an unfriendly government. The game itself takes place in a first-person perspective, and the player has to move quickly to launch missiles at enemy aircraft. I will state that this game is designed just like most of the other full-motion video games, where well-timed moves have to be made, and it's not really different with each playthrough because of the static nature of full-motion video. But the main exception with this game is that it seems to execute that gameplay element much better, especially when compared to a lot of the other games on the Sega CD. This game was very well reviewed and received upon the time of its release, mainly for its stunning visuals, but also that the core gameplay element was done very well. I would definitely recommend trying out this game if you have a Sega CD.
Make sure he's not on our tail. I've got him. He's gonna fire.
And I'm going to go ahead and group together these games that all rely on reflexes, basically because they all have different concepts but all share the same gameplay style. All of these games offer an arcade-style gameplay that was unique in the 90s but now has become severely dated. The shock and awe was supposed to be the full-motion video, and today it just doesn't look that good. So unfortunately, I don't think I would recommend any of these games today because of that, with the exception of games like Dragon's Lair because of its iconic status in video game history, but I don't find the gameplay of this fun. Really, I think the only game I could compare this to is the Simon game, where you just press up, right, down, and left in a repeated pattern. The only difference between Simon and these games is the time limit. I'm also going to throw in games like Prize Fighter and Supreme Warrior because they're pretty much relying on that same gimmick. And not only that, it's not well executed. I always get my butt handed to me in those games because I just don't know exactly what I can do to interact with the static content. I did find games like Ground Zero Texas a little bit more enjoyable because I did feel like I was interacting with the content a little bit more, but I didn't find the gameplay very fun. So yeah, titles like these are what I would say gave the Sega CD its bad reputation, with having a whole bunch of junk titles that were very gimmicky. I'm just going to state for the record that the only reason why I collected these games is because I knew I was going to be doing a review like this. Otherwise, I don't think I would have wasted my money on them. Some games I'm leaving out of this review are the light gun shooter games that I've already covered in my Is the Sega Minister Worth It? Part 2. It's strange to think that the Sega CD supported the Sega Minister light gun accessory more than the Sega Genesis by itself did. So if you want to see me review games like Mad Dog McCree and Who Shot Johnny Rock, as well as Corpse Killer and Crime Patrol, I would recommend that video after you're done viewing this one. Alright, so what are my thoughts on the full motion video games that came out for the Sega CD? Well, let's start with the positives first. I think that these games are best suited to on-rail shooter games. And it may be my personal preference, but I think these games really showcase the graphics better. This is a game where only the on-screen enemies really need to be interactive, the backgrounds just need to look impressive. And in games like Sylphid, this game is phenomenal. It actually looks like a lot of these graphics, since they're still that early polygon type, it looks like they could have been rendered on the Genesis. Microcosm is another game I'll point out as being a game that is fun. It's not the most advanced game, and yes, it's not the best on-rail shooter game. It does provide an ample amount of entertainment for what it is. It would have been a good weekend rental, and it's not too ambitious for what it was trying to accomplish. It was just trying to be a shooter on the Sega CD. So on-rail shooter games, I think, use this very well. Another type of game I think I would recommend for those of you, especially the ones that like the arcade-type games that used full-motion video back in the 80s, games like Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, all of these games were designed with Laserdisc in mind back in the 80s, and this would have been the first time to play these games exactly the way they were in the arcade in the home. And because most of these games use hand-drawn animation, I think they look better on the Sega CD than some of the full-motion video that tried to use live action. However, my personal opinion is that I'm not really a big fan of those games, mainly because it's just a memorization trick of which button do you press at which time, and it's more of a reflex challenge than anything. But again, you can't deny these games' status in video game history, and they're definitely an iconic piece of that time frame. Alright, now for the most commonly used things. How about the live action games that you just interact with? Well, again, you have more of those shooter games that I've mentioned before, but you also have games that are kind of like Dragon's Lair, and I don't think those games are very fun at all. I personally don't like games like Double Switch and Night Trap. Those games are just infuriating as a game concept. As a cheap horror movie for Night Trap, yeah, that provides some entertainment. I would actually prefer watching someone play through it than playing through it myself. The Sega CD of this version is very unforgiving. It gives you no hints about what you're supposed to do, and you're just supposed to spend a lot of time in the game. I'm assuming that was where you got your gameplay value out of it. It would take you a long time to figure out the random patterns, it seems like, because they couldn't store enough video on that to give you more than a 20 or 30 minute playthrough. And once you've beaten it, or if you decide to beat it, the game becomes really obsolete within 20 minutes of getting it. So I will kind of stray you away from those types of titles. Yes, the Make My Video games that they had out there, those are also a gimmick. I played them for maybe 10-15 minutes, got a good laugh out of the nostalgia of this is what entertainment was in the early 90s, and then I quickly moved on. So it sounds like I'm knocking full motion video games, but I really think it's just like every other game genre. Some are going to be better than others, and if you're instantly turned off by the low pixel quality of the video, I don't think you're going to enjoy this at all. But if that doesn't bother you, or you really like getting into a game, I think some of these can be fun. I want to say some of my favorites were Sylphid, Starblade, because those are just well-designed game concepts.
We at Sega Sports are pretty happy about the response to our new sports pack. One comes with a Genesis, or pick one with a Sega CD, and Joe Montana's NFL football.
So before we start looking at any of the games, let's go ahead and take a look at kind of the rise of some of Sega's most popular sports games.
Welcome back to Sega Sports. Hey, we're talking baseball. Sega Genesis Sports Talk Baseball. Sandberg's facing Ryan. Here's the voice of Sports Talk Baseball.
291. High drive.
Sega Sports was a brand used by Sega to market sports video games during most of the 90s and early 2000s. First appearing in 1993, Sega used the Sega Sports name for about 10 years, following in the footsteps of Electronic Arts' EA Sports label. Electronic Arts had almost become a second-party developer for Sega's systems, going so far as to hack the hardware so they could produce and manufacture their own game cartridges, which also allowed them better deals on licensing fees than other developers. Sega of America had been using sports personalities to sell games since the launch of the Sega Genesis in 1989, with lucrative markets from the National American Football Leagues, baseball, basketball, and ice hockey leagues, and EA's proven business model of releasing sports games annually with updated teams and statistics. Sega of America chose to create a dedicated Sega Sports team to handle the production and marketing of sports software. This new distinction was to help position Sega as a trusted brand for sports titles, that it was dedicated to the genre, and that Sega consoles were the best place to play such games. Sega's rivals, such as Nintendo, who were not producing their own annual sports games at the time, could then be painted as being indifferent to the genre. And at a time where marketing drove the industry, having a huge range of up-to-date sports titles was considered a huge plus by Sega. And though Sega created this brand specifically for sports titles, not all sports titles produced by Sega used the brand. There were a total of about 11 sports games that used the branding on the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. An additional 4 Sega sports titles were released on Sega CD, and just a few released on the Sega 32X. What drove Sega's hardware to prominence with sports titles, though, had to be its third-party offerings from Electronic Arts. EA Sports got their start with launching their John Madden football game, being the most realistic football simulator available at the time, on various computer platforms, with one of the first ports to a console being on the Sega Genesis. Therefore, it was only natural that EA would also produce many sports games for the Sega CD as well. So, one of the biggest changes that Sega made when they were making the Sega Genesis from the Sega Master System is the fact that they were going to target an older key demographic. And this didn't mean people in their 30s and 40s older, this meant people older than 8 and 9. So this would have a huge, wide variety of age groups, and I think the biggest one they were going for were teenagers. And it would turn out that this group had a huge interest in sports. So, if we were to put these games in one of Sega's self-defined genres, which one would it fit in? I think these would be actually more suited towards the enhanced cartridges. And since we're back on this topic, I am going to further clarify what exactly an enhanced cartridge is. According to Sega, an enhanced cartridge is any game that would basically use the same format of a Sega Genesis game, so the same kind of graphics, of course upgraded with the Sega CD hardware, but with a few key differences. The first being that it would use CD quality audio, or CD sampled audio, and it would sound much different than the stock sound chip on the Sega Genesis. The second enhancement to this cartridge game would be full motion video, and this is something that couldn't even be done on the Sega Genesis, with one notable exception. The Sonic 3D Blast had a full motion cutscene at the beginning of its game, but that was a rarity. Here's where we need further clarification. All of my examples I gave on screen when I was referring to this genre showed you a cartridge game next to its Sega CD port. And that's kind of something that's important to note. Sega didn't say that all of these were going to be upgraded versions of cartridge games. Some of these could be standalone titles that were only on the Sega CD and not the Genesis. So this genre actually includes both because they are enhancing the cartridge game style experience. Hopefully that further clarifies this point, as I did receive some comments stating that some of these games are only on the Sega CD. How can you say that they were an enhanced cartridge? Well, that's the reason why. ESPN Baseball Tonight is the only baseball game released for the Sega CD. It also had a Genesis port and made its way to other systems such as the Super Nintendo as well as PC MS-DOS systems. This game offers smooth gameplay and graphics, however, in terms of controlling and the actual gameplay, it is a bit frustrating. You have to be pretty spot on with your hits, and it is within pixel-perfect accuracy. This game gets pretty bad reviews, but I don't think it is all that bad. I would give it about 3 out of 5 stars, or a 60% rating. That's mainly due to the frustrations I had with this game, and the fact that there's kind of a big learning curve and it takes a while to get used to the controls. It doesn't have the pick up and play that I feel that a sports game should. And as playing against the computer can lead into nightmare territory, I would definitely recommend this with a second player.
He's safe! Check swing. Ball 1. 1-0.
Out of the 2 hockey games I have for the Sega CD, I think NHL 94 is probably the better way to go. And this game is often credited as being one of the best sports games from this time period, if not of all time. I credit that to its improved controls over previous versions, and an overall good presentation. It does have that pick up and play ability where somebody shouldn't have too much trouble getting used to how to control their characters, but provides a challenge that will keep you coming back for more. If you're a fan of hockey and you can find this game for either this system or the Genesis or Super Nintendo, I would definitely recommend that you pick up a copy of NHL 94 just to see for yourself how good this game actually is. NBA Jam was released on a variety of platforms and is the better basketball game here on the Sega CD. Though it was also released for the Sega Genesis as well as the 32X, I do like the Sega CD version for the fact that it does make a lot of improvements over the Genesis counterpart. The music sounds more like something you would hear in the arcade, and the graphics and scrolling seem to be a bit more smooth than on the Genesis. I also no longer feel like I'm tied to that 2D plane, actually having the ability to move in all directions. The game is not that difficult in my opinion, and I think it's something that will be welcoming to a lot of people who may not even be basketball fans. Overall, this is a worthy addition to your Sega CD collection, especially if you're a fan of the arcade-style sports games of the mid-90s. FIFA International Soccer is another great video game that was released in the mid-90s, and it also received ports for the Sega Genesis, as well as this port on the Sega CD. This game is virtually identical to the port on the Sega Genesis, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, as the original game was pretty good as well. Although this game is very well recognized for being a high-quality title, my only nitpick is that I do not appreciate the isometric perspective. It just plays tricks with my brain when I'm trying to push directions on the D-pad. It takes me a little bit to catch up on where my character should actually be moving. However, that is not a problem that is unique to this game, as any game using this perspective will have that issue. In terms of football games, I would recommend Joe Montana Football, but I decided to go ahead and feature one of these ESPN titles as well because the football version is actually not that bad.
Hi, I'm Chris Berman, and welcome to ESPN Sunday Night Football. Tonight's matchup will be a quick one. Why? Each of our ball clubs loves to run the football.
All 28 teams that were in the NFL at the time during the early 90s are in the game. However, the names of individual players are not, but I don't think that's going to be as big of an issue for people playing today. I do believe that the visuals in this game, particularly the graphics of the football field, could have been done a little bit better, but the overall gameplay style is very similar to other football games of the time.
Incomplete.
Links for the Sega CD.
As far as golf games are concerned, Lynx is the only one I could find on this system, and it plays pretty well. It actually reminds me a little bit of like the Microsoft Golf simulators that came on Windows 95 back in the day, and I found that a bit nostalgic, although I do think that players playing it today might get a little bit bored with it, as the graphics aren't as realistic as we're used to seeing today.
Get out your snorkel. That's destined for the hazard. In the water.
Fans of wrestling in the mid-90s will appreciate the WWF Rage in the Cage as the only wrestling game available on the Sega CD. Although I think this will appeal best to those that were fans of the WWF back then, as they'll be able to see some of their favorite wrestlers that maybe have been retired for several years by now. But I was surprised to see a few of them that are still active to this day, at least as of the time of this review. The controls here are pretty straightforward, although it took me a little while to figure out how to pin my opponents. Again, I feel this is one of those titles that is best played with 2 players.
1, 3.
Alright, so what are my thoughts on these games on the Sega CD? Let's get this out of the way first. I personally do not appreciate sports games on the Sega Genesis, and I think this is partially due to the fact that I'm not a really big sports fanatic in real life either. The draw for me on these games is the retro nostalgia. Yes, some of these games are still fun to play, and I do appreciate the retro style that they're made in. But these games were made to be the most realistic that they could do with the hardware at the time, and we could do so much better today. So if you're going for realism, that's completely going to be lost on you, and unfortunately, the rest of what these games have to offer isn't going to satisfy the average game player. Some of my reasoning and justification behind this opinion is the fact that you don't see people making sports games like these today, do you? So while I feel that these games are very important in the success that Sega had in the early to mid-90s, I don't think they are worth it today to start collecting them. Fortunately, they are cheap if you want to go out there and prove me wrong, but overall, I'm not a big fan of the sports games on this system, so I have a hard time recommending them to others. We are going to finish up the last game genre that was defined by Sega's president and CEO in North America. And this game genre was not really well defined, as it is called games that defy definition. Let's go ahead and take a look at these. Looking at this last genre as described by Sega, this genre seems to include anything that only offers interactive experiences and not really much gameplay. However, this genre was not really described much further, but I feel that it would include things like Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia here. This is not really a game, but it is an interactive experience where you're able to look up information and find pictures of items. This would be in the days before the internet would take over. In fact, this is not only one of the first encyclopedias to be offered on CD-ROM, it would most likely be the first that many people actually owned, as this was released for a variety of platforms. But again, most people didn't have a computer with a CD-ROM drive on it. While I would have loved to have something like this researching projects back in the day, I don't think this has much value other than nostalgia when viewed in the present. The same can also be said with the San Diego Zoo Presents The Animals, a true multimedia experience. Now that's a phrase that's not really said too often anymore either, is the phrase multimedia. This basically referred to something that happens on almost every web page we visit, but multimedia refer to things that were not only text-based but also could provide images, video, and audio. Again, this was at a time where that wasn't really commonplace in terms of software. But again, this is more of the educational variety and not much of a game. And since the audio visuals don't really hold up and the information is most probably out of date by now, this is another title that could be skipped over. But when thinking of other titles that could fit this genre, I think that some of the point-and-click adventure games could possibly be in here as well. In fact, to further support this claim, the developer of this game is called Sega's Multimedia Studio. But there is an element of gameplay added into this. The plot is set after the events of the 1993 film. A group of scientists are sent to collect dinosaur eggs at Jurassic Park. After the group's helicopter crashes on the island, a survivor, controlled by the player, receives a video message from a computer expert, and then the game begins. As stated before, this is a point-and-click adventure game with a strong emphasis on action sequences which require split-second timing. The player must search the island to retrieve eggs from 7 different dinosaur species and place them in an incubator at the Jurassic Park Visitor Center. All of this must be collected within a real-time 12-hour time limit. As a point-and-click adventure title, I think this game stands up to somewhere around the average mark. But as a Jurassic Park game in the mid-1990s, this game would have been abysmal, especially considering that most other adaptations of this movie were action and adventure games. And I don't know if it was just me, but I was expecting this game to be an upgraded port of the Sega Genesis game, which is actually very good. I can only assume that many kids out there at the time would have thought the same. Still, if you're a fan of these games from the early 90s and the point-and-click genre, I think this one is one that you should check out, and you'll be especially more interested in it if you're a fan of the Jurassic Park franchise. Now, when looking at these games, I actually didn't expect to come across a title that would be nostalgic from my own childhood, but this game is. This is The Secret of Monkey Island, which was a point-and-click graphic adventure video game developed and published by Lucasfilm Games. It takes place in a fictional version of the Caribbean during the age of piracy. The player assumes the role of Guybrush Threepwood, a young man who dreams of becoming a pirate and explores fictional islands while solving puzzles. Due to frustrations with other adventure games of the time, the game developers made the player's death almost impossible to happen, which helped focus players on the goal of exploration. This game was the 5th game built with the famous Scum engine, which was first developed for Maniac Mansion. However, it was heavily modded to include a more friendly user interface. When this game was initially released for PCs, it received critical acclaim for its humor, audio visuals, and gameplay. This port is based on the 1992 VGA re-release for the game, which was meant for IBM PC compatibles. It features an updated interface and CD audio soundtrack. But with a single-speed CD-ROM drive, the Sega CD conversion had much longer load times, which affect every transition in the game. An interesting side note is that this game also removes the infamous stump joke from older versions of the game. Basically, there was a tree stump in the forest maze which can be examined. Eventually, the game would ask for disc 22, then 36, then 114 to be inserted. After which, he says he'll have to skip that part of the game as these game discs didn't actually exist. The original game shipped on 8 5¼ floppy disks. When this game was initially released, Lucasfilm Games were bombarded with phone calls and letters by confused players thinking they could not access part of the game. So possibly for that reason, and the fact that everything fit on one CD-ROM, that was actually removed from the game. This game does not support the CD backup RAM cart, meaning a 4-digit password system was used to access later parts of the game. This system is limited and does not keep track of the player's location, minor items, and decisions that have been made. Overall, this is actually a pretty good port of this game, and I found it very nostalgic to go back to, although I did find the loading times to be a bit irritating, and of course I would prefer to play this with an actual mouse. But it is still perfectly playable with the Sega Genesis controller. The Adventures of Willie Beamish is a graphic adventure video game that was published in 1991 by Sierra Online. The player takes control of 9-year-old Willie Beamish in a game that somewhat parodies the adventure genre. The game pioneered the use of in-game graphics drawn to resemble classic, hand-drawn cartoon animation. While it was initially released for the MS-DOS and Commodore Amiga computers, it was ported to the Sega CD in 1993. This game starts out with Willie Beamish being sent to detention on the last day of school. The player is given the choice to either evade detention or wait it out. Either way, Willie returns home to his family after that. Many of the challenges presented in this game are typical choices that a 9-year-old boy must make. For example, whether to push his little sister on the swing set or how high to push her, whether to wash his dad's car, and whether to take his dog out for a walk. Making unwise choices can produce negative consequences. For instance, if Willie does not wash his father's car, he does not receive his allowance. And then he also can't buy things that he will need later in the game. This version for the Sega CD was noted for having slow loading times and slightly washed out colors due to the hardware limitations of the system. However, in an effort to make up for the slow loading times, the game has a feature where the player can select the start button and manipulate a set of twirling black and white balls known as manual laser balls. This edition also features a minigame on Willie's Nintari system in his bedroom. The minigame combines various elements from Space Invaders, Tetris, and Arkanoid. While some might view this game as a bit charming, I didn't actually really care for it much, but I think that's because I'm playing this game for the first time as an adult. It is very oriented towards kids, and the voice acting is, well, let's just say poor to be kind, but I think it would be more humorous for kids.
None of your business. What do you mean, none of my business? Just for that, I'm gonna beat the crap out of you.
Hey man, just kidding.
Panic is a puzzle point-and-click video game developed by Sega, and this one is a bit on the childish end as well. Interestingly, this is one of the few Sega CD games that supports the Sega mouse. This again fits this genre as not really being a game, and to tell you the truth, I think this game would be much more enjoyable if I was a kid playing this back in the mid-90s. As I don't really enjoy it now, I actually don't really get the point of this game. I think it's just set up to be a game where you click and wacky things happen. And last of the games that I own that kind of fit this genre of not really being a game is My Paint, the animated paint program. This was developed and published by Saddleback Graphics and Bridgestone Multimedia in 1993 for the Sega CD. And I guess I can blame the mere existence of this game only on one other product, and that is Mario Paint for the Super Nintendo. It appears as if this game was designed to compete directly with that game only, as it doesn't really offer much more than that game, and of course, due to nostalgia's sake, I think I'm going to say that I enjoy that game better. The only review of this game I could find at the time of its release is actually in a UK magazine, which is strange because this game never was released outside of the US. But they basically said that they couldn't classify it as a game at all, and didn't really comment on its potential except for maybe something for the kids to color on, rather than using an actual piece of paper and a marker. They did note that since there is no way to save what you create, they recommended plugging in the Sega CD into a VCR so that you could record it and save it for later. Which I guess is kind of what I did. So yeah, I don't know if I saved the best games for last, but I really don't think I did in this case because most of these aren't even games at all. I really do enjoy some games like these, but for things like Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia and The Animals, those are just kind of niche titles that I don't think is going to have a wide appeal, especially to gamers today. But for games like Secret of Monkey Island, I think that is actually probably one of my favorite point-and-click adventure games of all time, even still to this day. I especially find the Secret of Monkey Island very nostalgic because this is the game that I used to play a lot on Windows 95. And yes, getting it to work on Windows 95 was half of the fun, I guess I say fun, but it's kind of annoying getting MS-DOS games to work on Windows 95 machines, but it's something that I remember fondly now that I'm older, because that was something I used to have to deal with all the time. But to tell you the truth, I think I actually might prefer the version on the Sega CD now, or at least on game consoles now, because of how easy it is to get it set up and running. All you need to do is insert the game disc and turn the console on. No configuring drivers, changing video modes, audio cards, it's just all there. And yeah, I do find the lack of a mouse to be a little bit annoying, but it's something I got used to quite quickly, and I was able to relive a lot of fond memories with this game on the Sega CD. Alright, but now that we've wrapped up the gameplay portion of this review, let's go ahead and take a look at its legacy and how it's remembered today before I tell you my thoughts on it. The Sega CD ended up being a success for Sega in a couple of ways. First, they actually outsold their rival, selling almost 2.24 million units in the limited life cycle of this accessory. And second, the Sega CD was successful in placating home video game console owners by having the cutting edge in home video game technology before the next system was ready to be released. However, the Sega CD saw a sharp decline as soon as announcements of that console came to light. And going forward in the future, Sega would eventually put all of their resources into that console, while still allowing the Sega Genesis base system to serve as a budget console, as there was still a huge customer base for that system. The Sega CD did have different variations throughout its life cycle, one of them and most notably being the JVC XI system, also known as the Wonder Mega in other parts of the world. This system did not sell as well without Sega's brand name on it, however it was able to play both Sega Genesis cartridges and play Sega CD games all in one unit.
Encyclopedia. Hey, it's a CD player, plus you get stuff for free. So now it's see what you can do when you apply yourself? One mind, one machine. XI, multi-entertainment system. Call 1-800-JVC-XI.
The best-selling variation of the Sega CD was the Model 2 add-on for the Model 2 Sega Genesis. This was most likely due to this console being cheaper and also more reliable than the Model 1. However, I think my favorite variation of this console is the Sega CD-X, which offered not only the Sega Genesis and Sega CD in one unit, but also doubling its purpose as a portable CD player as well. However, due to its high price at the time, this system did not sell well, and due to its rarity today, it is also very high in price.
The Simpsons is brought to you by 3DO, the most advanced home gaming system in the universe. What are you playing with?
As early as 1993, with the introduction of the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, it basically rendered the Sega CD technically obsolete and sharply reduced the public interest. And possibly as a result of that, in late 1993, less than a year after the Sega CD's launch in North America and in Europe, the media started reporting that Sega was no longer accepting in-house development proposals for the Mega CD in Japan. This news was a major blow to the public image of the Sega CD, as that announcement was pretty much interpreted as Sega of Japan walking away from the add-on. Sega of America, however, would continue not only to invest into heavy advertising for the system, but they would also become the #1 developer for games for the Sega CD altogether. This would further increase the divide between the agendas of Sega of America and Sega of Japan. In early 1995, Sega shifted its focus to the Sega Saturn and discontinued advertising for Genesis hardware, including the Sega CD. Sega would officially discontinue the Sega CD in the first quarter of 1996, saying that it needed to concentrate on fewer platforms, and felt the Sega CD could not compete due to its high price and outdated single-speed drive. The last games scheduled to be released for the Sega CD were Myst and Braid Dead 13. However, those were eventually cancelled. Looking back on the Sega CD, the reception of it is very mixed. Some praised certain games, but others criticized its low value for its money and limitations on the benefits it actually provides to the Genesis. This is listed as one of the worst-selling video game consoles of all time. However, I feel that is a bit of a misnomer, as this is really an add-on and enhancement to the console rather than its own standalone console. Reviewer Blake Snow from GamePro noted that the problem with the Sega CD was threefold. The device was expensive at $299. It arrived a bit late into the 16-bit life cycle, so some people didn't want to waste their money on a console that was going to be quickly obsolete when they already had other options such as the 3DO and eventually the Neo Geo CD that was also released in this life cycle, or they can just wait a couple of years for the next gen to begin. And it didn't really do much to enhance the gameplay experience, other than enhancing graphics and sound. However, I feel the biggest nail in the coffin for the Sega CD was the lack of support from Sega. The poor support of the Sega CD has often been criticized as the first link in the devaluation of Sega's brand. In terms of its game library, critics note that the game quality is all over the place, with many critics noting that possibly the greatest Sonic game of all time was released for the add-on, but then you also had a variety of other games that are just junk throwaway titles, with some stating that if you wanted to look for most of the worst games released during the 16-bit generation, one doesn't need to go much farther than the Sega CD library. However, in terms of nostalgia, those that grew up with this system, while limited in number, do fondly look back on this add-on as a moment in time where game add-ons that could increase the capabilities of your current game console was a viable concept and provided a fun and entertaining experience. When I was researching ways that the Sega CD has been remembered by gamers and fans of the console, it's kind of divided. A lot of people say that they like the games on the Sega CD and that all of the people who say that there was nothing but garbage released for the console don't know what they're talking about and you need to try this out now. On the other side, I see a lot of people who say that there were only junk titles released for it, the games that people say are worth it aren't really worth it, and no one should be collecting this console. The only praise I see that's very common on this console is the Sonic CD game and games like Snatcher, maybe Lords of Thunder thrown in there, but there's not really a lot of consensus on a lot of these other titles. But where do I fall in all of these different perspectives? Well, I think that the Sega CD was designed at a time where it needed to be on the cutting edge, it needed to extend the life cycle of the Sega Genesis and make it technically superior to all of its other competition. The Sega CD was actually designed to compete with the TurboGrafx CD, actually more aptly the PC Engine Super CD Duo or whatever it is. But another advantage to this accessory in North America is that it was going to get the jump on Nintendo yet again by releasing their peripheral before Nintendo could release theirs. So that's where I really think that this product really shined and would have been most relevant. I don't think it is as relevant today in gaming history as it was back then when people were trying to be on the cutting edge. A lot of the games that I enjoyed on this system are also available on either other platforms or even as a cartridge on the Sega Genesis. And yes, I do appreciate the upgraded graphics and the upgraded sound especially, but I don't really know if it's worth it today to get that upgrade anymore because really people are looking for the more retro feel. And in that case, if you are, you're going to be looking for games that are maybe a little bit more primitively designed. I think the biggest drawback to it today is its price. Obviously, I felt it was worth it once to collect this, and I kind of saw myself as a bit of a casual collector back when I bought this piece. But again, in modern times, when I was researching how this console is priced these days, it is astronomical compared to what value it's going to add to your Sega Genesis. So in a way, we've kind of come back full circle. It has a lot of good games for it, and it does have a lot of games that were kind of junky that don't live up today, but I think what really holds me back from recommending it for others to collect is the fact that it's going to fit a niche market and the price is too high. It's strange that we've actually come back to that point, because if this thing was down to around the price of what it costs to collect a Sega Genesis, I would definitely recommend it. I mean, it's worth it for that alone. And I was not expecting to find a bunch of great titles on here, some of which are exclusive to the Sega CD. When I bought this console, I was looking for a couple of games. I was looking for Sonic CD, and I was looking for Star Wars Rebel Assault. Strangely, that didn't end up being one of my favorite games on this system. It's actually towards one of the lower junky titles. The only draw for me is the fact that it is a Star Wars game, and I guess I'm a sucker for those. So overall, while I do feel that there are some games that could be worth it to collect this accessory, I think that price is going to be the main thing that drives people away from this, and is probably the most influential reason why I would not recommend collecting this console, at least for the casual collector. But anyway, that's just my opinion. What do you all think of this accessory, especially for those of you that grew up with it? I really look forward to seeing what your experiences are on this accessory down in the comments below. But that said, not only does it wrap up this video, this actually wraps up this series on the Ultimate Sega CD review. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned because I have more content coming. I'll see you all in the next one. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.